For anybody who follows my channel, you'll probably know that I've talked in the past how I'm not a huge fan of double tracking effects or plugins. We do have this option in the Helix. We have effects blocks such as the double take, and I've done videos on it before, but I always kind of come out with results that I'm not overly happy with. Well, that is until now. With the firmware 3.15 update that we recently received from the fine folks over at Line 6, they've added a plugin called the ADT, which is an automatic double tracker, but it comes with a twist. Anybody who's followed my channel will probably also know I'm a real big fan of vintage gear, such as the LA Studio compressor, the Retro Reel tape simulator. I love these effects that add nice glue and gooiness to the sound, and that's exactly what the ADT is. It's a double tracking effect, but mixed in with being able to customize this double tracking effect as if we're running it into two different tape machines. So we can add things such as the wow and flutter and the tape saturation to each of the doubling sounds. So without further ado, let's dive over to Hxedit and take a look at this amazing new addition to our Helix and HX Stomp. So here we are over in Hxedit, and I have a little preset set up just off of the normal template that I always use. I have a little placator dirty with these settings. I've tweaked slightly into a 412 greenback 25 with a 121 ribbon, 3 inches back, low and high cuts off here, but I do have some low and high cuts at the end here. A little bit of room reverb and a little bit of low and high shelf, just like normal little LA Studio comp at the end. Nothing out of the ordinary. You'll notice though, I've added in a Retro Reel plugin just for comparison purposes, and we'll get to that in just a moment. That's going to be off right now. And I have the new ADT in stereo. I have the ADT placed after the amp, and all the other effects blocks after it are going to be in stereo. That's going to be important because if we put a mono block after this, it will collapse that stereo signal into mono. We also can use the ADT in mono. I like, for my purposes, to really focus on the stereo version, but everything we talk about here today is going to be applicable to the mono version, obviously, except for things such as the panning controls. And, you know, we'd want to use the mono version if we wanted to use the ADT in front of the amp, which is also a possibility. We can do some pretty interesting things with that. But for this video, I'm going to be focusing on using it after the amp block and in stereo. So let's take a look and see what we have on the ADT. We have delay 1 and delay 2. As I mentioned, the ADT is like running our signal into two tape decks. So we're going to be basically doing tape emulation on both of these sounds. So we could have delay 1, we have delay 2, how much each of the two signals are going to be offset. We have wow and flutter 1, wow and flutter 2, saturate 1, saturate 2. We have deck volume 1 and deck volume 2, deck 2 polarity, modulation rate, modulation depth, the overall output level of the effect. We have tape speed, we have texture, we have low cut and high cut, we have pan controls for deck 1 and deck 2, we have an envelope threshold, and we have trails, which I'm just going to put set to on. So this effect can seem a little bit complicated, and I find a lot of folks sometimes will look at effects like this, and if they don't understand what everything does, they kind of just run away from it and don't use it, and maybe possibly miss out on a really good effect that they could put to good use. So I'm going to try to break this down in a way that you understand. So delay 1 and delay 2, let's just start zeroing things off here. I'm going to even off the deck volume. Actually, I'm going to take down deck volume 2 and just deal with deck volume 1 right now. We're going to deal with the delay first. So delay is going to be how much we're going to offset this to get a double tracking effect. So you'll notice I've taken down deck volume 2. So what I have here right now if I go to a snapshot with no effects on, so you'll hear there's not a huge difference. I'm going to take off the high cut. I'm going to take off the low cut. I have the deck 1 pan center, envelope threshold off. I'm going to take the texture control down, the moderate and mod depth. Not that that affects tape deck 1, but we'll talk about that in a second. So basically, I'm not delaying it. I'm going to put this up to 30 inches per second. And let's just listen to the difference. And I have two snapshots here. I have with no effects and with the ADT. I'm going to play both. Watch up here. When I go to snapshot 2, that's just going to shut off my ADT delay. And it's not going to have the retro reel on either. When I go to the retro reel, here it's going to turn the retro reel on and turn off the ADT. And we're going to do this for comparison purposes. But first of all, let's go to no effects, see what happens when I add in the ADT with these settings, basically with everything kind of turned off. So there's a very subtle change. Now, the reason I did this, I said, well, let's look at the retro reel. If we put the wow and flutter on 0, the saturation on 0, set it to 30 inches per second, here's what the retro reel sounds like in comparison to the no effects. Now I'm going to compare the no effects to the ADT with those similar settings. So that kind of illustrates that when we come into the ADT, get rid of deck 2, don't add any delay, and kind of keep all the wow and flutter and saturation down, it's just adding a very subtle tape effect or tape emulation to our tone, which is really cool. But we probably wouldn't use it this way because we do have the retro reel, which is doing something similar. But I just want you to hear how those two things compare. But that's not really what this is about. What we can do is we can put delay into these different tracks. The delay one goes up to 20 milliseconds. We can add wow and flutter to these. So I'm going to add a little bit of delay, say 5 milliseconds. Let's bring that wow and flutter up. All we're listening to is deck 1 right now. So the wow and flutter kind of determines how much of this warbly kind of tape sound we're going to get in each deck. So when we put it up to 10, it's subtle, but we still hear this kind of unsteady warbly sound. The Saturate controls are going to add analog tape saturation. Now, if we really crank these up, it's going to potentially get kind of nasty, but maybe that's what you want. So if I go to opposite extremes here, or we can be much more subtle about it and just bring a little bit of it in. So you can see it can add a real nice effect to the tone. Now, I'm going to take this opportunity to jump down to our texture control, because this can be a control that is a little bit confusing for some, and they may use it and not notice a difference. So the texture is adjusting the amount of NAB tape EQ in the simulated path. So when saturation is set to 0, we could put the texture all the way up. We're going to hear no difference. It's transparent. So it isn't doing anything there, but when we add the saturation, I'm just going to go to the extreme again, saturation on 10, what you'll hear it texture does is it kind of tightens up or loosens the distortion. So here it is with saturation on 10 with texture on 0. So I think that was pretty obvious. That's going to work on both decks. So, I mean, if we have our saturation on 0 and we're playing around with our texture control, we're kind of wasting our time because it's really not going to do anything for us. So if we are going to add some saturation, though, we can alter it. So even if we had lower settings, it is going to allow us to be able to tweak our saturation levels. Okay, we'll bring those back down. Now we move on to some of the other controls. We obviously have the deck volume. So let's say I have both of these decks up at 0 dB. I'm now hearing both decks. I have 0 delay on deck 2, but let's say I add in 15 milliseconds. The range for these is interesting because the deck 1 goes from 0 to 20 milliseconds and deck 2 goes from 0 to 200 milliseconds. But let's start off here. Let's go 5 milliseconds on one, 15 milliseconds on the other. We can decide how much we like each balanced against one another. We also have a deck 2 polarity if we wanted to invert the polarity. So that's going to be up to us to decide which we prefer the sound of. Now we also have, I'm just going to bring these both to around -3 for now. We also have modulation rate and depth. Now the modulation rate and depth only control deck 2. So this is one of those things we need to know about this. If we had deck 2 volume off, we can bring in the modulation rate and depth. And we're not going to notice any difference because it's only on deck 2. Now, what we will do for this example is let's bring deck 1 all the way down. And we're going to bring deck 2 up so we can see some of these features that work just on deck number 2. So let's take a listen to see what this mod rate and depth do. I have the wow and flutter and the saturation off for deck 2 right now, or at their lowest setting anyways. Here it is with none of this modulation, rate at 0.1 hertz and depth at 0. Let's go to extremes. You especially hear it on the tail end of the chords. So the nice part about this, the fact that it's only affecting deck 1, it's going to allow us ways to customize one deck against the other to really give a more interesting double tracking effect, because we don't want the double tracks to be identical. Otherwise, there's really no point in doing it. So it's giving us ways to be able to tweak these. So we'll talk about that some more in a minute. The tape speed is interesting. Even at these settings here, we can listen for the difference between those. So 30 inches per second. You'll hear as we go down on tape speed, we get a darker, kind of more smooth, gooey sound. And as we get to 30 inches per second, it's more pristine, less of that tape effect, right? So again, if we were to bring up the wow and flutter to a high setting, we now hear that the rate of modulation from the wow and flutter also changes as we adjust this. Let's keep it up at 30 inches per second right now. We've already talked about the texture control. Low cut and high cut are much like the low cut and high cut on any other effect. If I bring this all the way down, we can cut off frequencies above and below a certain point. I'm just going to leave those off right now. That's very typical of other effects that we have that we can use low and high cuts on as well, such as our stock cabs. Now I'm going to come back to the Deck 1 pan and Deck 2 pan in a moment. Let's come down to envelope threshold. Envelope threshold is going to be a really interesting thing. It's only, again, going to affect deck number 2. And it's going to allow us to be a little more dynamic and control what Deck 2's modulation does by how hard we pick. So with it off, you can kind of hear... Now I'm going to bring that all the way up. So when we pick harder, we're now going to get little slight pitch fluctuations. Now that might be too much, but if we bring that down a bit, versus if we have that off. So it gives us yet another way to offset Deck 2 and give it a little bit of a different sound than Deck 1, which can be very cool. I think the important thing to remember with all this is subtleties, right? We don't have to always use a sledgehammer or hit everything very hard. We can go with very subtle moves just to offset the sound between the two tape decks. Now, Deck 1 pan and Deck 2 pan to me are going to be two of the most important features. Now, here's why. Let's do this. Let's pan Deck 1 hard left, Deck 2 hard right. We're going to bring Deck 1 volume back in here so that they're equal. And this is what we end up with. Now again, if I take that and I have both centered, right? I'm not crazy about that sound. Whether I invert the player to Deck 2 or keep it normal, I find everything's kind of on top of one another. When I do double tracking for real in the studio, not using a plugin or an emulator, I always tend to pan these out left and right somehow. So even if we come out, let's say left, right, left 50 and right 50, we start to get something nicer. So as far as how I would set this up to get a really interesting sound of it, there is something of note here that's quite interesting. If I have both of my deck volumes up somewhere equal here, but if I take them both down, we end up with basically no signal. So that's telling us that we don't really have a mix control here. So we're not really, as far as I can tell, getting a direct signal. We're basically taking our signal, splitting it into two tape decks and processing those each without any of the remaining original signal. So if I was to just sort of get both of these balanced equally, I would probably go with a setting of 0 just to get my direct sound out of one of the effects. Pan it hard left and hard right. I always like to pan these types of effects, take full advantage of the stereo. And then maybe add somewhere in the vicinity of 15 or 20 milliseconds to delay 2, maybe add a touch of saturation to 1. And it's all about using these controls to offset each one just slightly. I personally don't think I would put too much of this modulation in. I would probably go more with maybe just a little bit of wow and flutter on one. Leaving the texture maybe in there around 4. One thing you can play with is the tape speed. But another thing we could actually do to even fatten this up more is we could pull this down to a parallel path, and we could set this to split AB so that we could blend our direct signal. Now, if we do this, you'll notice that if I turn this off altogether, I still get my direct signal. If I turn this on, the ADT, I'm still getting a blend of my direct signal. So now if I take my deck volumes down, I'm actually now getting some of my direct signal. So we could set both of these up just at 0. Now we could say maybe I'll offset one of these by 10 milliseconds, deck 1, maybe 20 milliseconds on deck 2. Add a little bit of wow and flutter to each. Little different though, separating them out. Maybe touch more saturation. I don't know. Maybe we'll come in with a little bit of depth here. Change the rate up. Leave the texture as is. Let's go with a gooey 7.5 inch per second since we are going to blend in the direct signal. We'll still keep these panned hard left and right. And maybe even bring in a little bit of this envelope threshold. Now what we can do, that might seem a little maybe like it's too much. I'm actually going to bring my level control up here. But now we can go back to our mix AB, and if we mix in more of the A path, our direct signal, we're going to now be able to kind of blend in the ADT. Versus with no effects on. I really like this method of working because we can have as much or as little of it blended in. If you find that sounds too modulated and artificial, we can just keep rolling this back. Until we find where we want it. I think a lot of times some folks use this and they think of it as having to be used in a very heavy-handed way, and it doesn't. If we use it on a parallel path like this, we can blend in that direct signal and add just as much of the double tracker as we want. So what do you guys think? I hope that was helpful, and I hope I explained that in a way that was easy to understand, and I hope you have a better idea now of how each of those parameters works. Keeping in mind that some of those parameters only affect deck 2 because we're kind of trying to offset them from what deck 1 is actually doing. So very, very interesting stuff, and I think that's a great new addition, and it actually is the first double tracking effect that I find I can actually get something kind of workable out of that doesn't bother me in giving it too much of an artificial sound to it. So that was very interesting. I like what it does to the sound. Gives it that really vintage goo to it. So if that's something that you think you could put to use, throw that into your presets and see if, now that we've gone over what the different parameters do, see if that helps to be able to allow you to dial in something that's really usable. So please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would get some use out of watching it. Also subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification, get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.